Well, hi everyone, and welcome to week number 7 of the course. We are almost there, very close to the finish line. This week we are going to be looking at issues such as unions and collective bargaining. Now, up to this point in time in the course, we've introduced you to a variety of different skills and techniques that you can use to better manage human resources in your organization. But some of the influences that are placed upon HR managers come from outside, and they come from the environment. And one of those environmental influences is the influence of unionization. Now, we know in the public sector, unions have become very, very important. Unions impose upon leaders and organizations a myriad of limitations and constraints and challenges that go beyond just civil service requirements. So traditionally, we would think about the limitations placed upon the actions of a manager in the public sector, and we would think about it in terms of, well, these are civil service employees, and so we have certain regulations and policies and procedures that we must follow to ensure that we are protecting the civil service protections of those individual employees. Well, in addition to those civil service protections, we also now have a collective bargaining agreement, and we have a contract. So it's important for us as managers to understand what's in those contracts, where those contracts come from, how those contracts are negotiated, and realize that it's just not the civil service regulations, but it's also the contractual obligations that we also need to be concerned with. So the two main topics we're going to look at this week are public sector unions and then the collective bargaining process that is used to create that contract. So in terms of public sector unions, we will talk about the rise of unionization in the public sector. We will talk about the roles played by unions. We'll talk about what unions do in terms of creating bargaining units and then how those bargaining units will then interact with management. We'll talk about some of the challenges that unions have faced recently. Most notably, we will focus on the Janus decision. And in addition to your reading for this week, I also have a link that I provided in the week 7 resources on the Janus decision and the impact of the Janus decision on union membership. Now, according to that article, which comes from Governing Magazine, you'll see that the Janus decision really hasn't had a negative impact upon union membership, but what it has had a negative impact upon are things like fair share agreements. And so historically, even if an employee who is part of a bargaining unit did not belong to the union, that employee still had to pay fair share, their fair share. They still had to pay fees to the union. The union then could take those fees and use them for lobbying, for political types of purposes, advocacy types of purposes. Well, as a result of the Janus decision, it limited the ability of unions to charge these fair share fees. And the concern on the part of unions was once these fair share fees go away, they're going to lose a lot of the revenue, and they could actually end up hemorrhaging membership. And Janus did take away those fair share fees and that source of revenue and limited the pot of money that unions have to engage in political advocacy. But what apparently Janus has not done, at least up to this point in time, again, it's still a relatively recent decision, is that Janus has not had a detrimental impact upon the number of employees who belong to unions. So unions, even in the wake of Janus, have a big influence upon what we do in human resource management, from the hiring process to the evaluation process to the reclassification process to training and development opportunities to compensation to sanctioning and discipline. Typically, all those issues at the state or local level will be collectively bargained over and will become part of the collective bargaining agreement, become part of the contract. So unions do have a profound impact. How you interface with your unions is the collective bargaining process. So contracts will be temporary in nature. You may have a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year contract, but at some point in time, you're going to engage in collective bargaining, whereby management will sit down with the negotiating team from the bargaining unit to hammer out the details of a new contract. Now, you don't always negotiate everything all at once in the collective bargaining process. It's very common to have what are called reopeners in a collective bargaining agreement. So for instance, you may come to a contractual agreement for, say, 2 years, so it's a 2-year contract, but you may agree to have a salary reopener after 1 year. So the union may say, we'll agree to everything else for 2 years, but we think the government, the agency, may end up getting a little bit more revenue next year. So we want to be able to reopen those negotiations over salary increases next year rather than waiting 2 years in the future. That's called a salary reopener. The types of issues that are within the collective bargaining process will depend upon the type of government, the level of government that you are dealing with. So for instance, at the federal level, issues like compensation are typically not included within the collective bargaining process. They are not within what we consider to be the permissive scope of bargaining. So the scope of bargaining speaks to the types of issues that may be collectively bargained in the process. A permissive scope of bargaining means that these are issues that are included within that scope. And some states have very permissive scopes, some have more restrictive scopes. At the federal level, compensation is not within typically not within the permissive scope of collective bargaining. And one of the reasons why the federal government typically does not collectively bargain over compensation is that Congress sets the compensation for the general schedule for the federal bureaucracy. Since Congress sets the general schedule, it is beyond the control of bargaining units and individual agencies to circumvent that general schedule and that compensation schedule. So typically you will not see compensation for most federal agencies included within the collective bargaining agreement. Compensation recommendations for increases in compensation come from a federal panel. That federal panel usually meets a couple of times per year. That panel will then make recommendations to Congress in terms of increases and recommended increases in compensation. Congress then agrees and the president signs off on it. Then that goes into a new salary structure in the general schedule. So compensation usually is not within the permissive scope of bargaining at the federal level. However, it is within the permissive scope for most state and local governments. And indeed, it oftentimes becomes the number one issue in the collective bargaining process. Work conditions are also typically important elements in the collective bargaining process, usually within the permissive scope of bargaining, especially at the state or the local level. Now again, some states have a very permissive scope where they will allow most issues to be bargained over. Other states will have a much more limited scope. I'll give you an example. Back when I was in graduate school, I worked on a project when I was doing my dissertation, working with the school districts and working them through their collective bargaining process. And one of the issues in Ohio that was not within the permissive scope of bargaining for school districts was privatization. And this was when privatization was very popular across the country. We saw privatization in just about every policy area, and especially in education. Local bargaining units for local school districts were precluded from negotiating over privatization. That was not within the permissive scope of bargaining. So it really does depend. Work stoppages, how work stoppages will happen. Sometimes that provision will depend upon the type of position you're talking about, whether it's a public safety position or not. Very classic example of that was back in 1981, the Reagan administration with the air traffic controllers. Air traffic controllers went on strike. President Reagan said, you're not allowed to go on strike because you are a public safety position. If you go on strike, I will fire you. The air traffic controllers who went on strike were summarily fired by the Reagan administration. Reagan administration then rehired new people, or hired new people to come and fill those positions of the air traffic controllers who have been fired. That's an example of a public safety position that is not allowed to have a work stoppage because of their importance for the safety of society. Sometimes you'll see the same thing with police departments, sometimes with fire departments. So how the collective bargaining process works and how the negotiation process works will differ, not just depending upon the level of government you're dealing with, will also differ in terms of the type of position and the nexus between that position and public safety. Now, in the collective bargaining process itself, The collective bargaining process is something that's supposed to be based upon good faith bargaining, supposed to be based upon trust, and organizations, whether they be the bargaining unit or whether they be the agency, need to try and avoid what we call ULPs, or unfair labor practices. Unfair labor practices typically can be adjudicated at the federal level by the Federal Labor Relations Authority. So at the federal level, you have two different bodies that will help oversee and manage the collective bargaining process. You have the National Labor Relations Board, and you have the Federal Labor Relations Authority. And the Federal Labor Relations Authority should sound familiar to you because that was one of those agencies that was created by the Civil Service Reform Act in 1978. Vast majority of federal agencies and departments will be under the auspices of the Federal Labor Relations Authority. The U.S. Postal Service, because it's a government corporation, is actually under the supervision, if you will, of the National Labor Relations Board. But if one of the two parties, either the bargaining unit or the agency, feels that the other party is not bargaining in good faith and is engaging in an unfair labor practice, they can take that unfair labor practice claim to, at the federal level, probably the Federal Labor Relations Authority. If it's at the state or local level, like here in California, it would go to what we call CalPERB, Public Employee Relations Board. And CalPERB for the state of California serves many of the similar functions that the FLRA will serve for the federal government. CalPERB also gets involved whenever there's what we call an impasse in collective bargaining. So when the two sides cannot come to an agreement, they can declare an impasse. When they declare an impasse, CalPERB then gets involved to try and alleviate that blockage and to try and get past that impasse. So here in California, it would be CalPERB that would intervene. At the federal level, there's something called the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service. And the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service can send out arbiters, can send out mediators to try and break this blockage, this impasse. There are a few ways in which you can deal with an impasse. One way we'll talk about this week is fact-finding. Fact-finding, you would bring in an external fact finder. That fact finder would then review the proposals up to that point in time, would do some background research on how the negotiations have been going, and then will produce a fact finder report. In many instances, fact finder reports are not binding, but what they will do is they will place PR pressure, if you will, on either the bargaining unit or on the agency to kind of give in a little bit. So if you look really bad in the fact finder report, that's probably going to be an impetus for you to maybe give a little bit more the next time you go to the negotiating table. Then there's also mediation. That's what the Federal Mediation Conciliation Service oftentimes does, where you'll bring in a mediator. The mediator will sit down with both parties, try and hammer out some details of an agreement between the two parties. Then there's also arbitration. If you really need to come to an agreement, both sides may agree to what's called binding arbitration. Binding arbitration is when an arbiter comes in and imposes an outcome on both parties. And we'll say this is the final outcome and both parties must abide by it. If you really, really need to come to an agreement relatively quickly, your best hope for that is what's called final offer binding arbitration. And in final offer binding arbitration, arbiter will come in and will tell the bargaining unit, the union, give me your final proposal. We'll say to management, give me your final proposal. We'll compare those two proposals. We'll pick one of those proposals, and that selected proposal will then become the contract, and that will then become the agreement. Now, again, it's a high-risk type of proposition because if the other side's proposal, their final proposal is the one that is chosen by the arbiter, you're kind of out of luck. So, but if you do need to come to an agreement in a pretty quick time schedule, final offer binding arbitration usually will provide that outcome for you. But again, these are just some of the topics we're going to talk about this week as we talk about the influence of unions and what that means for how we manage our human resources and how the collective bargaining process kind of changes what we do in all aspects of how we manage our personnel. Even though you only have negotiations going on for part of the year or maybe for part of one of every 2 years, it's still something that looms over everything that goes on in the organization. So give you an example, in my district, we have what's called a meet and confer process. So if the union feels that there's something going on in terms of work conditions or how employees are being treated that they feel could have an impact upon the contract, they could ask for a meet and confer. And at that meet and confer, management from the district will sit down with the bargaining unit from the union, and they will talk about these issues to determine whether or not they're having an impact upon the provisions in the existing collective bargaining agreement. So even though you're not in active negotiations, you could be in meet and confer throughout much of the year. And I've seen in some situations, meet and confer happens on an almost monthly basis. In other situations, it rarely ever happens at all. But just to know that negotiations is always something that's going to be hanging over the head of HR managers because it has such a profound impact upon how we manage our personnel on a daily basis. Again, a lot of good information this week, and that's what we're going to be covering, unions and collective bargaining. For week 7, I have the usual resources there for you. There's the older version, the textbook PowerPoint, and then there are the newer versions for chapters 11 and 12. I, again, have that website there for you, the impact of the Janus decision on union membership. You can take a look at that. A couple of videos on there for you as well. In terms of your assignments this week, you have 2 of them, one a small minor one and one a really big one. The small minor one is a journal entry, a professional journal entry for this week, looking at representative bureaucracy, essentially asking the question, how important is representative bureaucracy? How important is it for the government and government employees to represent and reflect the community that they are serving in terms of socioeconomic characteristics, race, ethnicity, gender, education level? How important is it for government to represent the constituents that they are serving? You'll take a position on that depending upon what you believe about how important representative bureaucracy is, and that will then be your journal entry. Very similar to the types of journal entries you've done previously. Again, we don't get too hung up on APA or formality with the journal entries. It's more your reflection and giving me your position on the issue. So how important is representative bureaucracy? That's the topic for your journal entry for the week. Then you have this critical assignment that you already create your outline for. You're going to be putting together the final paper, the critical assignment paper. We've talked about this assignment a couple of times already, so I won't spend the time going through it again, but it is again described for you in the week 7 resources. It's an assignment Dr. Sundstrom has put together. You can read through it again, make sure that you are covering all of the questions and all the major points of the paper. This is a formal paper, so you want to make sure that you incorporate theorists adequately in the paper. You want to make sure that you adhere to APA format. You want to make sure that it is a formal paper, that you have proofread the paper, that it's devoid of typographical and grammatical errors. This is your critical assignment for this class. I'm sure you've done these before, so you know that whenever you submit the critical assignment, you'll be doing it at the link also provided here, the Submit Critical Assignment link. That will send it through TestStream, as you are aware of, and then I will evaluate the paper through TestStream. All critical assignments and all courses in the program must be evaluated by instructors through TestStream. So again, I'm sure it's not your first course in the program, so you've been to the rodeo before and you know how it works. So that's all the information for this week. I look forward to reading your papers and look forward to reading your journal entries. I'll get to grading your week 6 assignments and get those back to you with some feedback as quickly as I can. Otherwise, I hope everyone has a great week. If you have any questions at all, as always, feel free to send me an email, or you can always use the Q&A link in the classroom. Happy to answer any questions you have. Have a great week, and we're almost at the end, and pretty soon we'll be in the final week of the course wrapping things up. So have a good week.